Ah, Giardia. If it wasn't such an annoying disease and parasite, it might actually make a pretty cool first name. Hey, this is my daughter Giardia. Unfortunately, it is a parasite and it can cause all kinds of problems, not just in humans, but in dogs and cats and your pets as well. And so today we're going to talk about this rather annoying parasite that can be potentially life threatening in some cases to not only humans, but animals and pets as well. And so Giardia is actually about three different species that will cause disease in humans and in pets: Giardia lamblia, Giardia intestinalis, and Giardia duodenalis. And these are interesting little organisms that are dorsoventrally flattened. And so they're kind of smushed up into like almost a pancake sort of look. And they actually don't have nearly as many organelles as most eukaryotic cells because they are obligate parasites. In other words, they need that host in order to cause an infection. And because of that, it has a really strange metabolism. And in fact, like human beings, we consume sugars and they do too, but all they do is basically waste the sugars and the energy that we consume because they live in our intestines and they consume our sugars, but they waste it via a process called fermentation. They don't have the ability to go through aerobic respiration. And so the only thing that they can do when it comes to making ATP is use something called substrate level phosphorylation, ferment a couple of ATP for every glucose molecule, essentially waste it, but they don't care because their host is going to constantly give them more nutrients. And so it doesn't matter if they waste it. And if the glucose is running low, they actually have the ability to do amino acid metabolism and take some of those amino acids and make energy from that as well. So Giardia is actually found all over the world, and it's more prevalent in areas where there's poor sanitation or unsafe water, especially in areas where wastewater and drinking water are not being properly separated. And there are reservoirs in humans and in some wild animals, and certainly in dogs and cats and in livestock. Now, this particular parasite is transmitted via fecal oral route, which means you wind up, or an animal winds up, ingesting the cysts, and that causes an infection. And over time, that animal that has that infection will pass cysts in their stool, and that will lead to further infection. What's really interesting about this organism is it doesn't take a lot of the Giardia cyst to cause an infection. And in some cases, maybe as few as 10 to 50 cysts can cause an infection. Now, if you are somebody who's going to be traveling to an area where there's poor sanitation, you're somebody who maybe works in a child daycare center, if you're hiking and potentially drinking untreated water, immunocompromised individuals, they're all going to be at an increased risk of Giardia. So how does it cause all of its problems? What is the life cycle and the pathology? Well, an individual is exposed to the cyst, and a cyst is basically like a metabolically inert type of Giardia. It's not really doing a lot of metabolism, and that cyst will protect it from things like desiccation, which means drying out, UV light. Doesn't really need to eat when it's in the cyst form, and so when it's in the environment, it's basically in a cyst form, and that's the form of the organism that has to be ingested in order to cause infection. If the actual vegetative Giardia protozoan is ingested, it's going to be killed by the acidity of the stomach. And so the cyst can survive that acidity. And when it gets swallowed, it goes through the stomach. And then one of the most interesting things happens about this parasite. The cyst recognizes environmental factors such as, wow, look, I'm in the stomach. There's a really acidic pH here. I'm in the right temperature. I have the right osmotic pressure. I have the right moisture content. And then it excystates, which means the cyst is released, and now you actually have the active Giardia organism. And it's going to go through and it's going to start attaching, especially to our intestinal wall, where it will take our nutrients from us. And as I've already mentioned, pretty much waste them. But an interesting thing happens with Giardia as it's traveling down our small and then large intestine. It starts to sense that the moisture content of its environment is slowly going away as our large intestine basically absorbs more and more of the water that we consume. And so the organism begins to form that cyst once again in preparation for eventually leaving the body and going out into the environment where it must be in the cyst stage in order to survive. Now, if there's a good thing about Giardia, it doesn't go through epithelial tissue and it doesn't get into the body. It just lines the intestine. But that can still cause a lot of problems. And so it can cause malabsorption of vitamins and nutrients and other minerals. The protozoan is now competing with us for the carbohydrates and amino acids that we consume. Giardia will cause massive amounts of diarrhea and bloating, flatulence, abdominal cramps that can lead to weight loss, severe dehydration, and for young children and those who are immunocompromised, it could eventually lead to death, and that could certainly happen in your pets as well. Okay, so how do you treat Giardia? One of the most common ways is with metronidazole. This is an anti-protozoal, and there are other drugs that are anti-protozoal as well that will destroy the Giardia, and these drugs have a really, really good history of clearing Giardia, usually within a week. Rehydration therapy may also be required, especially if someone's had a lot of diarrhea for a prolonged period of time. And so sometimes an IV is necessary, certainly consuming fluids, provided that the individual can keep them in and keep them down, which can be a little bit tough. Keep in mind that there may be some asymptomatic carriers who are not experiencing all the symptoms that we talked about earlier, but that could still be passing the cysts in their stool. Now, prevention is really, really important. It's always a lot easier to prevent something than it is to treat it after it's entered the body. And so one of the main things, as we kind of hinted at earlier in the video, is keeping your drinking water and bathing water and cooking water away from wastewater. That is extremely important. Boiling can help, but a lot of times the cysts can be resistant to boiling. And so filtration is really important. And again, just keeping the wastewater and drinking water separate. Personal hygiene is also extremely important. So things like washing hands, especially after going to the bathroom, especially before preparing somebody's food. If you are in a daycare setting, making sure you're washing your hands after you're changing children and that kind of thing. Properly disposing of all waste matter, making sure that it's not going to come into contact with drinking or bathing water, and just public education in general that this thing does in fact exist and that we want to take steps to try to prevent it. So hopefully now that you know a little bit more about Giardia, we can do our due diligence in making sure that it is not continually spread throughout our communities. And especially when it comes to pets, make sure that you're cleaning up after them properly, because if one pet has it, it can be easy for it to spread to others. As always, thank you so much for being here. Have a great week.